race a lot longer than those that are not the faithful few.
Right. Okay, appreciate it. Thank you. Yes.
I wasn't here last week, but I run into that a lot when I'm teaching people. They do not like the idea that there's only a faithful few. They think that the majority are the ones that are right. And even though their plan is a lawless plan, to stop short of being saved the way God said, but they really rest on that. They don't take it serious. They don't care about looking into it because it's only the faithful few. Oh, the Church of Christ, the latest thing I've heard, oh, the Church of Christ, they don't let women do anything over there. That was one of my neighbors that I was trying to go share my faith with. So, but I mean, they rest on not truth, but what's common.
Right. That's good. It's a popular idea that we can do whatever we want to, and somehow God's going to be pleased with that. So another way of saying that is what? Is truth is narrow. It's not broad, it's narrow. Truth is very narrow. So, I mean, I know in the age we live in today, I don't know if you've ever heard of the concept of postmodernism, but our society is engulfed with it. And one of the tenets of postmodernism is they have this concept that, there is no absolute truth, but everybody has their own truth. Okay, so who are you to tell me, what's truth, what's right and wrong when I have my own truth? And I'm sure it won't be long till we start showing up in the stores, and people start, well, we already are. People are stealing things right and left, they don't want to pay the price. But it would be like going to the store and saying, here's something for $10, and you say, well, my truth is it's only worth $1. That's what I'm going to give you. It's $1, and I'm going to walk out with it. Well, how well does that work, So we learn from that, truth is narrow. Everybody doesn't remain faithful until the end, and that's unfortunate, but it's a fact. I think one of some of the things we've been talking about already is this idea of once saved, always saved. That's a common religious belief, but it's not true, and it's demonstrated by that. And while many members of the church would probably tell you, no, once saved, always saved, it's not true. But when you look at the way they live, you look at the way they think, the way they act, they kind of believe that because they think, okay, just because I'm a member of the Lord's church, I'm guaranteed I'm going to go to heaven. And they don't live accordingly. They don't study like they ought to. They don't do the things that are required to be faithful to God. So they may not say they believe it, but in actual practice, they really do. Some other things I thought about. Think about the age that we live in today, how much emphasis is put on what the supposed majority of people think about something. I mean, people lie all the time, and they lie in polls, and in these polls, you never know how accurate they are, and most of the time they're lying because they're trying to influence opinion. They're trying to influence the way you think. Well, what's the motivation? I mean, what's the word I'm using for? The angle that they're taking is, well, most people, they think, want to be in the majority, and if we can convince you this is what the majority is thinking, or this is what the majority wants to do, then we can get you into that group also. And you see that over and over again and when it comes to political ideas, when it comes to religious ideas, what's the majority think? Most people want to go with the majority. And yet we know that the majority is not right. Just because something is a majority view doesn't make it right. The only thing that makes it right is whether God authorizes it or not. And so we see there's a lot of pressure put on people to try, a lot of lying that's done, a lot of pressure that's doing to try to force people into this mold of this is the way the majority of people think, and you don't want to be an outsider. And I mean, I think most of us have kids, and we can remember when we were kids, well, everybody else is doing it. Why can't I do it? Well, that's the same concept. And so this idea of a faithful few, an obedient faithful few, contradicts that whole idea, because it's telling us that just the fact that it's a majority doesn't make it right. Even even advertising, I mean, how is it they try to get people to buy stuff as well? You don't want to be the only person that doesn't have this. You need to go out and buy it. Yes?
The point is very, very critical to us today. We see this happening, and a lot of times it's our loved ones or our family, and we try, and I know that is a comfort to know that God is aware of that's going to happen.
Right.
And we can say, as long as we plant that seed and try to live the life appropriately there, that we've done all we can do. We cannot force that other. And I think it's a comfort for us. I've used that in a lot of cases sometimes when you see somebody that's really worked hard with their family trying to get them, but they can do nothing with them. Well, I mean, a lot of people carry that as a guilt factor. I think this is one reason God gives us that as a teaching mode. That's going to happen to us.
Right.
And we got to face it. It can hurt us.
Right.
But we got to face that and let that be.
Right.
I mean, we're taught in the scriptures that as they was leaving the city, if they couldn't be accepted to wipe the dust off of the same thing here when we're working with people and trying to get to people. It's the same concept as what you're talking about, because the world has taught all of this over here, and it's not like the one that we know.
Right. That's true. And people have free will. Our kids have free will. So they're not programmable. I mean, we can point them in the right direction, but it's still their choice whether they continue to follow in that direction or not.
But it causes guilt in so many people.
Right.
They can't do that, and they've got to learn to leave that guilt. There's no reason to have guilt
Right.
when you've done the best you can do.
Right. I mean, it's off the lesson a little bit, but think about Adam and Eve. They were the only parents on the earth. And look at the difference in the outcome of Cain and Abel. So we have to assume they raised both of them up pretty much the same way. I mean, we don't know how many other kids they had, but at least in those two cases, same parents, same type of upbringing. And the sons, because they had free will, they chose separate paths, and we have to remember that. One other thing I'll mention, and then we'll get into looking at some Bible verses, is being faithful to God is hard. It's not easy. And we look at how many things that people don't do because it's hard. People, in general, people take the path of least resistance, so they take the easiest path. I mean, if you think about things from a non-spiritual standpoint, if you look at just things in the world, how many major accomplishments are done and so forth, major inventions and things like that. Why isn't it that everybody is coming up with some major invention? Why isn't it that everybody is coming up with some major, concept that really moves society forward, some technological breakthrough? Why isn't it that everybody does that? Why isn't it that everybody is not a professional football player? I mean, the bottom line comes to is, one, people have to have the ability, and we know that with God doesn't hold us responsible for doing anything that's beyond our ability to do. So he holds us responsible for using our abilities, but we have to combine that ability with what else? If we're going to, in order for us to accomplish anything, we have to have ability and we have to have desire. We have to want to do something with that ability. Now, sometimes people will add opportunity to that, and some opportunities I think we can create. If we got enough desire, we can create opportunities. But yeah, we have to have opportunity too. So what it really boils down to is what our desire is. Because our abilities are what they are, we can improve our abilities, certainly, if we have the desire to do so. And so it really comes down to our desire and how hard we're willing to work for something. And so if you value highly, the money, the prestige, the popularity that you get for being a professional sports player, then you're willing to do all the hard work. You're willing to go out there and, and risk, getting something broken, getting a concussion, getting hurt. You're willing to go through all of that because the outcome that you want is highly desirable to you. But to those who that outcome is not highly desirable to, they're not going to put forth the effort to do that. So this whole concept here is something for us to really think about. It's not something, going to heaven, it's not something that God gives us just because, we just happen to be a participant on a team, so to speak. We just show up. We have to put work into it. And I think that's what's being talked about here, is because things are hard, people often don't want to put in the work to do it. They don't value what they get out of it enough. And that really comes down to love. And, some of the scriptures, I know you're all familiar with them, and we've studied them before. But, Jesus said in Matthew 22, verses 37 through 40, he said, "Thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, with all thy soul, with all thy mind. This is the first and great commandment, and the second is like unto it, thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself." Well, he's talking about loving God with your whole being. As we talked about agape love, another way of saying that is to value. So when we don't have the right values, we're not going to do the right things. And if we don't have the right values, then we're not going to be faithful until the end. And it's hard work to be faithful to the end. And so I think those are some of the reasons why it's important for us to understand this lesson and for us to study it. In Exodus chapter 23, verse 2, God told the children of Israel there, he said, "Thou shalt not follow a multitude to do evil, neither shalt thou speak in a cause to decline after many to wrest judgment." Well, that's something we really need to take to heart, because how many people follow the crowd? It doesn't matter where the crowd's going. It's, I want to be part of the crowd. They don't think about whether the crowd is going the right direction or not. They don't want to be left out, so they want to be part of a group. And that's what's the word I'm looking for? That's how peer pressure gets to us. It's because if we value being part of a crowd, if we value being, popular, if we value being part of a large group, if we value that more than valuing doing what's right, if we value that more than pleasing God, then we're going to be susceptible to that type of pressure. And so this is something that we need to realize. Another reason for studying this lesson, and then we'll get to some other points, is remember in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, in verse 12, he says, "Wherefore let him that thinketh he standeth take heed lest he fall." Well, we all have a danger of doing that, to think, well, we got our ticket stamped, we're on our way, nothing can happen, we're not going to fall, we're going to make it. And yet, when we have that attitude, that's the very attitude where we're most susceptible to falling and being tempted to being tripped up and losing our soul, because we're not thinking right. Instead, we need to be like Jesus told us apostles to watch and pray, because we need to watch out for temptation. Yes, you talk real loud so I don't have to get too close.
That's the armor. And having kids. So first, 2 Chronicles chapter 31, it talks about the Levites and their sons and wives and their daughters keeping themselves holy. And that's the big thing about being the faithful few, is being faithful enough to keep yourself holy.
Right.
And in that keeping, in that I'm going to pull myself away from, you're pulling yourself away from all the glitz and glamour of being like everybody else. And that's just extremely, as you say, that's extremely hard.
Right.
And it's why, like Chuck said, it's very important for us to be together, to have more faithful few members, for have that membership and that love, because it's so hard to keep ourselves holy alone.
Right. Because of Hebrews chapter 10, what's he tell them before he tells them not to forsake the assembling of themselves together as a manner some were doing? What does he say? We're to come together to provoke one another and to love and to good works. And that's That's one of the purposes of coming together in the assembly. And that's what we're doing now. We're provoking one another unto love and to good works so that we need that encouragement. And that's why God planned the worship service and planned a Bible study in the way that he did. So let's look at some verses where Jesus talks about this. First, there was a number of examples that was given in the book, and y'all are all familiar with, about examples of a few people being saved. We're very familiar with Noah and his family. Out of the whole earth, there must have been millions of people alive at the time, and only 8 people were saved. Only 8 people were found to be righteous. Now, our world is getting worse and worse and worse, but we're still not at the point where there's only 8 righteous people in the whole world yet. But yet, that was the situation then. And he said the earth was filled with violence. The people were evil. We studied recently about Lot and his family. Out of the whole city of Sodom, however many people was there, only Lot and his 2 daughters made it out okay. His wife didn't, because she disobeyed God and turned around and looked when she was told not to. We recall that when the children of Israel, when they left Egypt, they didn't believe that God was going to be with them and help them conquer the land. So when they sent 12 spies into the land to spy it out, the 10 of the spies came back and said, "Oh, these people are just bigger than us. They're more powerful than us. There's no way we can take it." And yet Joshua and Caleb said, "We're more than able to do it, because God's going to help us." And it made them so mad, they were getting ready to stone Joshua and Caleb. And so it was at that point that God said, nobody above the age of 20 was going to be allowed to go into the promised land. They were all going to die in the wilderness. So however many hundreds of thousands of people there was at that time, maybe there was over 1 million that left Egypt, only 2 of those that were over 20 made it into the promised land. And you might wonder, well, what was magic about the age 20? Well, 20 was the age at which you could fight in the military. So this was an army that was not willing to fight. This was an army that chose to ignore its commander and wouldn't go fight. And so that's why that age was picked. One other example not mentioned in your book, when you think about the 7 churches of Asia, there's a message in there for us, isn't it? Out of 7 churches, did he have nothing but good things to say about all 7 of them? Well, he did commend them for the things that they had that were commendable. Some congregations didn't have anything commendable, so they didn't say anything good about them. But there was only 2 congregations out of those 7 that Jesus didn't have any words of censure for, and that was Smyrna and Philadelphia. So is there not a lesson here in that all congregations of the Lord's church throughout the world, we can't assume that all of them are pleasing to God, that some of them fall into the category of these other 5 congregations, and that we got to really work hard, to make sure that the congregation that we're a part of is faithful to God, and we don't need to do what he tells the individual not to do. Wherefore, let him that thinketh he stand take heed lest he fall. As a congregation, we don't need to do that either. We don't need to think, well, we got our act together so well, that nothing can ever happen to disrupt our faithfulness, and that's not true at all. We have to be constantly on our toes to prevent that from happening. So when we look at Jesus' teaching about only a few being saved, in Luke chapter 13, beginning at verse 22, it says, "And he went through the cities and villages, teaching and journeying toward Jerusalem. Then said one unto him, Lord, are there few that be saved? And he said unto them, strive to enter in at the strait gate, for many, I say unto you, will seek to enter in, and shall not be able." So right there, Jesus is telling him, he asked the question, is few going to be saved? And he kind of gives him kind of an indirect answer, but he says, this is going to be a straight gate. This is going to be a narrow gate. It's going to be hard to get into. And many people will try to get into it, but they're not going to be able to. And the fact that they're not going to be able to is not going to be God's fault, but it's because they didn't put forth enough effort to try to get into there. So he's telling us that this is a gate that takes effort to get into. And that's why he says strive to get into it. And if we think about it, one brother made some comments about this. If you think about, a narrow gate, and, somebody being really big, when you think of the luggage that they're carrying with them, all of the sins and pet sins that they carry with them that they want to keep, there's no room for them to get through that. They got to get rid of that luggage for them to be able to get through that narrow gate. And if they're not willing to do that, they're not going to get in. So Jesus himself in his teaching here gives us an indication that few people are going to be saved. He expands on that idea in Matthew chapter 7, beginning of verses 13 and 14, where he says, enter ye in at the strait gate, for wide is the gate, and broad is the way that leadeth to destruction, and many there be which go in thereat. Because strait is the gate, and narrow is the way which leadeth unto life, and few there be that find it. So again, we're talking about strait in the sense of being narrow, confined. When we're talking about the narrow, the word there is kind of the same concept, but it also means that it has adversity associated with it. Sometimes that word is translated as narrow there, is used in terms of adversity. It kind of goes hand in hand with the idea that, that it's a difficult path to get into, and it's a narrow path. It's really tight and constrained, so it's not something that you can just easily glide into. It takes a lot of effort to get into it and to stay on it. Yes.
I didn't know what the Greek word is.
I'm sorry.
If we have to find it, we've got to be searching for it. And there's a process in searching, and there's a reward in searching, and that it doesn't come easy gives it it's that throne of great value.
Right, and that's very good, because those are my very next points. So thank you for bringing those up. Yes. Because he talks about how there's few that will find it. And finding is talking about there, you're searching for it. You find it something after you've searched for it. It's not just you just stumbled upon it. You just by random chance come upon it. In Matthew chapter 7, verse 7, what did Jesus say? He says, ask and it shall be given you, seek and you shall find, knock and it shall be opened unto you. So here we say that Jesus is telling us, and we know God is telling us, that if we're looking, if we're sincerely looking, we're going to find it. And I can't think of any better example of that than the Ethiopian eunuch. Here was a man and Cornelius, they were all searching for the truth, and God brought about a way for them to be able to hear the truth. He gave them the opportunity to hear it, and then they heard it and they obeyed it. They were seeking. God knows whether we're seeking or not. In Acts chapter 7, verse 26 and 27, he says there, and he hath made of one blood all nations of men for to dwell on all the face of the earth, and hath determined the times before appointed and the bounds of their habitation, that they should seek the Lord, if haply they might feel after him and find him, though he not be far from every one of us. So if we don't find God, if we don't find this narrow gate, if we don't find this path, it's not God's fault. It's our fault because we haven't been looking for it. And oftentimes people think they know what they're looking for, and they're blinded by their own biases and their prejudices or what they think something looks like, and so they miss it. They don't see it. And that, of course, we know that was one of the problems with the Jews when Jesus was on earth, is he didn't meet their expectations of what they thought the Messiah was supposed to be. They were looking for a political deliverer. They were looking for, a physical king to come and liberate them from Roman rule and reestablish the kingdom and make it as great as it was when David was king. And that's what they were looking for. And so they were blinded by that bias, by that mindset that they just couldn't get rid of, that Jesus was never going to come for that purpose. He came to establish a spiritual kingdom. He came to deal with, provide a means of salvation for people's sins. And despite all the miracles that he did, they didn't see it. They chose not to see that. They would not see it. In Isaiah chapter 59, verse 1 and 2, it says, "Behold, the Lord's hand is not shortened that it cannot save, neither his ear heavy that it cannot hear. But your iniquities have separated between you and your God, and your sins have hid his face from you that he will not hear." So again, it's not God that's avoiding us. It's not God that's not wanting us to find him. But if we don't find him, it's because of problems that we have in searching. We're not searching diligently. We're not searching in a manner that we really want to find out what's the proper way to please God. In Matthew 20, verse 16, and Matthew 24, verse 14, it says there, "For many are called, but few are chosen." Now, how does God call people? Through his word, through the gospel. In 1 Thessalonians chapter 2, verse 12, Paul's writing to the Thessalonians there, and he refers to them. He says that God had called them unto his kingdom and glory. And then in his second letter to the Thessalonians, in chapter 2, verse 14, he says there, "Whereunto he called you by our gospel to the obtaining of the glory of our Lord Jesus Christ." So many people are called when the gospel is preached to many people, but yet only those that are chosen are the ones who choose to obey the gospel. So again, it's not God refusing to choose people who want to come to him, but it's people refusing to do what's necessary to answer God's call, because we know that the gospel lays out the conditions that we need to meet in order to have our sins forgiven and to come into a covenant relationship with God, and most people are not willing to do that. In 1 Timothy 2, verse 4, it's talking about God. It says, "He will have all men to be saved and to come to the knowledge of truth." So we know that while many are called, few are chosen, it's not because God doesn't want all people to be saved, because he tells us that he wants all men to be saved. In 2 Peter 3, verse 9, it says, "The Lord is not slack concerning his promise, as some men count slackness, but is long-suffering to usward, not willing that any should perish, but that all should come to repentance." So again, God doesn't want anyone to be lost. So the fact that people are lost, the fact that people are not chosen, it's not because God doesn't want them to be saved, but it's because they are not willing to do what he says is necessary to have their sins forgiven and to be able to obtain a home in heaven when they die. They don't want to live in accordance with God's will. Another one of Jesus' teachings, which we're all familiar with, that tells us that, again, that only a few are going to be saved, is the parable of the sower. Both Matthew, Mark, and Luke have an account of this, and Mark and Luke have some different words in some parts of this, but we remember there's 4 different types of soils that are there. The sower is sowing the word. He's preaching the gospel. And out of these 4 different types of soils, which represent 4 different types of hearts of people, how many of those soils actually produced fruit? Just 1. So you had 3 different types of soils there that didn't, the seed didn't grow up and mature and produce any fruit, and 3 of the different types of soils, but only 1. So right away, that's telling us, that not everybody that hears the word is going to obey it. In fact, the vast majority of people that hear the word is not going to obey it. Something. We'll read these verses real quick and make some additional observations. But in Matthew chapter 13, verse 18, he says, "Hear ye therefore the parable of the sower. When anyone heareth the word of the kingdom and understandeth it not, then cometh the wicked one and catcheth away that which was sown in his heart. This is he which received seed by the wayside. But he that receiveth the seed in stony places, the same is he that heareth the word, and anon with joy receiveth it. Yet hath he not root in himself, but dureth for a while. For when tribulation or persecution arises because of the word, by and by he is offended. He also that receives seed among the thorns is he that heareth the word, and the care of this world and the deceitfulness of riches choke the word, and he becometh unfruitful. But he that receiveth seed into the good ground is he that heareth the word and understandeth it, which also beareth fruit and bringeth forth some 100-fold, some 60, and some 30. Now, in my opinion, I think a lot of Christians fall into the category of the seed falling among the thorns. And I'll tell you why, because look at what happens here. They get distracted because of the cares of the world and the deceitfulness of riches. In Mark chapter 4, verse 19, he adds, and the lust of other things. And in Luke chapter 8, verse 14, he adds, are choked with cares and riches and pleasures of this life and bring no fruit to perfection. So what do we have a description here? We got people who actively received the word. It started growing in them. The plant started growing up. And then what happens? All of these things that are distractions to a spiritual life, they get caught up in all of these physical things. And we don't need to look at these things and say, well, okay, this is talking about, evil stuff. Well, it's evil in the sense as things that God doesn't want us to get caught up in. But a person who gets caught up in his job, he's working too much, he ain't got time for physical, he doesn't have time for spiritual things because he's caught up in his job. I mean, some of that, when it talks about the deceitfulness of riches, talks about the pleasures of this life. How many people work because they tell themselves, I want things better. I want better things for my family than what I had growing up. And while there's maybe some good to that, I'm not saying there's not. But if that's your total focus, if you focus too much on it, then you're not focused on the spiritual things that we got. So what I see in these verses here is a description of what happens when people are not paying as close attention as they need to their spiritual welfare, and they just get caught up in the day-to-day living of dealing with the different things in life, and so they lose their focus on spiritual things, and before long, they've drifted so far away, sometimes they don't come back. And other times, if they do, they're surprised at how far I drifted away. So to me, this seems to be like it's more of not so much of a conscious thing that I've just decided, I don't value what God values, and I'm just going to make a choice right now. I'm just going to quit and I'm going to leave. But it's a much more insidious, tricky thing because it happens without you realizing it because you've lost. You're not paying close attention like you ought to, and it just happens. Yes?
I had a very close friend who shared the gospel with him 40-some-odd years ago. He was very faithful. He went through a lot of struggles to stay faithful. And I called his wife about a month and a half ago, and said, so how's Larry doing? He said, he passed away last year. But I want you to know that he stopped believing. He said the Bible is just a fairy tale.
And that may be one of those, that happens, but they draw the wrong conclusion but.
She said,
right.
He just got discouraged and he just stopped going to church.
Right. And that's why we need to keep an eye on each other as much as we can and try to encourage people so they don't fall away. And that's a lesson for this too. Yeah. That's a big lesson, that we all can work on, me, everybody. If we know each other well enough, then we can pick up when they start struggling, when things start happening, and okay, they're not behaving the way they used to. Something's going on. Some kind of problem is happening, and then we can help them. It's easier to help them and maybe more successful in helping people that way than to wait until, okay, well, they've been gone 6 months, nobody knows where they're at, and then you come to them, and not only do they have the problem that caused them not to be away for 6 months, but then, you know, they're upset. Well, why did it take this long for anybody to notice I wasn't here? You know, and that just adds on top of it. But I think that this is a valuable lesson that we need to learn here, is that we need to watch out. We need to always pay attention and not lose sight of what we're doing. You know, there was if you look at the descriptions here where he talks about the cares and the riches and the pleasures of this life, I mean, that's just talking about the day-to-day problems of life. We let that overcome us. But it's talking about the pleasures of this life. I mean, the Bible tells us that, you know, there is pleasure in sin. I mean, if sin was always unpleasurable, if there was always a hurt that we got from it, then people wouldn't do it. But the fact that there's some benefit that people perceive that they get out of it, even though it's a false perception, you know, that's the attraction, and that's why we have to avoid it. Because even in case, you know, of working too much, where you're not focused on spiritual things. I mean, what's the pleasure they're looking for? It's for the worldly goods that they can get, or if I just had more money, then I wouldn't have to worry about paying the bills. You know, I wouldn't have to worry about, you know, how am I going to make my house payment and things like that. And you know, somebody told me a long time ago when I was just starting to work, and maybe you've heard it too, and it's a true statement, is the more you make, the more you spend. So it is not the case at all that, you know, if I just had more money, I would have more money to put in the bank, and I would just be in a better financial situation, because it just generally doesn't happen that way. You make more, you spend more, and so you're not getting as far ahead as you think you would. And then, as we've seen in the past 18 months, I mean, who would have predicted 5 years ago the economic turmoil that we're seeing now? Who would have predicted that for this country, for the world? So just because you think you might be doing what's necessary to make sure you don't have any financial problems, it doesn't mean that that's going to happen. Let me close with this one. In Matthew chapter 19, verses 23 through 24, he says there, verily I say unto you that a rich man shall hardly enter into the kingdom of heaven. In Mark chapter 10, verse 24, he says, how hard it is for them that trust in riches to enter into the kingdom of God. And then in Luke chapter 18, verses 18 through 25, there's the account there about the rich young ruler. And we remember, you know, he was wanting to know what he needed to do to enter into the kingdom of heaven. And he was faithful in a lot of things, the Old Testament law, but Jesus could see into his heart, and he saw that his wealth was a problem to him. So he tells him to go sell all that he has, give it to the poor, and then come follow me. And he wasn't willing to do that. So what we see here, what Jesus is saying, is that people that are wealthy, as a general rule, a lot of times they value their money so much, they value the wealth that they have so much, that they're not willing to, that's more important to them than it is serving God. And so that's why it's hard for them to enter into the kingdom of heaven. And lest any of us think here, well, I'm not wealthy, I'm not rich. Think again. You know, how many of you walked 5 miles here today because you couldn't afford a car? How many of you are going home tonight to live in a hut that has no air conditioning, no running water, no indoor plumbing, no indoor bathroom, doesn't have a refrigerator, you don't have food stored up in there? I mean, lots of people in the world fall into that category, and we don't. So yes, we are rich, we are very affluent, and so the same problem can happen to us, and that does happen to affluent societies a lot. And so we need to take caution in all of this. So It's 8 o'clock, so I appreciate everybody's attention. And what's the lesson next week, Jeff? The Word became flesh next week. Okay, thank you.